Our next speaker is Riya Parekh. Are some lives valued more than others? Applying a Jain lens to animal welfare law. And I look forward to this talk also.
Okay. Jai Jinendra, my name is Riya, and I'm very excited to explore the question today, are some lives valued more than others? And I'll be applying Jain philosophy to make the case for stricter animal welfare laws. So to give a brief intro, I am a political science graduate who is on the pre-law track at Cal Poly SLO. I'm also the director of community relations at the Young Jains of America. And my overall motivation in choosing this topic stemmed from my interest in the intersection of law, justice, and morality. We currently see that our legal system is imbued with our moral values and is ultimately a reflection of our underlying societal values. So I was curious to see how Jain values can reshape our legal system to be more just ultimately. Now, diving into my central question, I asked, are some lives valued more than others? And in a system that offers equal protection under the law, I was curious to see which lives were valued less than other lives. Currently, it's very interesting that the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment applies to both people and corporations, but not animals in the same way, which I think reveals some key gaps and limitations in the law. So today, my main thesis or argument will be to apply Jainism as a framework to advocate for animals as living beings with rights and moral worth. And that we see current laws still failing to recognize this and permit animal cruelty in many different instances. So my hope today is to use Jainism to provide a better moral foundation and grounding for the law. Going into a roadmap, first I'll be going into some background and talk a little bit about the scale of the problem and what animal welfare means. Then I'll dive into the legal landscape and talk about some existing laws and where they fall short. Next, I'll talk about our Jain framework. And then finally, I'll present my conclusion. So in the status quo, we currently see around 10 million animals die each year from abuse, neglect, and cruelty in the United States. Over 10 billion land animals are also slaughtered for food annually, and 99% of them live in factory farms where they experience things like extreme confinement, unnatural diets, genetic manipulation, which according to many animal rights groups is considered to be cruelty. And according to the World Animal Protection, the United States actually received a D in its grade in animal protection. And so these, I think, overall staggering numbers really prove the rampant abuse and cruelty throughout our system. Now, I think it's important to define what is animal welfare. And so we boiled it down to three tenets. The first is that animals should be able to live natural lives. This means being able to express their natural behaviors and being able to stay in natural looking enclosures or out in the wild, preferably. Animals should also be healthy, both physically fit and well nourished, and they should also be free from suffering. So these three tenets should guide our laws on animal welfare. Now, to go more into depth about our legal system, I'm going to provide a quick overview of the main laws that govern animal welfare. And the first is the 1966 Animal Welfare Act, which is our primary federal animal protection law. And this sets the minimum standard of care when it comes to handling, transporting, and breeding animals. And it narrowly defines animals as well as warm-blooded animals used in research or experimentation purposes. What's very important to note here is that it excludes farm animals and lab animals. And so that unfortunately accounts for a majority of animals. And it also legalizes what is known as common farming practices. So even though certain practices may be cruel, such as mutilation or overcrowding or slaughter, as long as they are considered to be common farming practices, they're considered to be legal under this law. And we also see that there's insufficient oversight by the USDA when it comes to prosecuting and investigating cases of animal cruelty just overall. And so this law, while it is intended to protect animals, has a very narrow scope, sets very minimal standards, and there is weak enforcement throughout. The second major law is the PACT Act. And this was the first federal law that criminalized egregious forms of cruelty. It was only like recently introduced in 2019. However, it does exclude common cruelty issues such as neglect and abandonment. And it only sets a penalty for intentional abuse, again, exempting customary and normal agricultural practices. And so still, despite these two laws being on the books, we see that common abusive and cruel farming practices tend to be legal, and most animals remain unprotected by these federal laws. So now this reveals many of our legal shortcomings and flaws. And the first, I think, is the loopholes and exemptions that we see. There are many loopholes and exemptions in just the text and the wording of the law. And more importantly, the law still takes no position on whether a practice is humane and whether or not it causes suffering to the animal. Rather, it makes certain activities legal or illegal based on how it affects humans and based on human utility at the end of the day. And so that's why we still see that certain farming practices are considered legal, even though they are cruel. We also see fragmented enforcement between state and federal laws. And so animal cruelty is primarily considered a state crime, and very few federal protections exist. As just mentioned, there are only very few federal laws on the books. And then third, we have the distinction between both like punitive and protective laws. So for example, the PACT Act only criminalizes extreme actions, but it doesn't actually call for more proactive accountability. And so there still needs to be more legislation or rulemaking that calls for that sort of proactive, systemic, and corporate accountability. And finally, we actually see that there is deterrence inbuilt within the law. So for example, with agricultural gag laws, these punish whistleblowers and activists who document animal cruelty, which creates a chilling effect and makes it even harder to hold people to account. And this is prevalent throughout many states, as seen on the slide here. And so what are some of the legal values that underpin our system? And the first one I found was that animals are treated as property, and we consider them to be personal property or goods. And animal laws themselves are therefore not designed to prevent cruelty or establish rights for the animal, or sorry, are designed to prevent cruelty, but not establish rights for the animal itself. Yet animals are not like inanimate objects or property. Similar to children, they actually have preferences and relationships and a level of autonomy as well that should be respected and recognized within the law. The second value I think that underpins our legal system is the idea of human utility. And we see that animal welfare laws only selectively punish cruelty when it aligns with human interests. So as I mentioned before, common farming practices are not selectively punished or not punished by the law because they serve our human interests. And so we see that animal cruelty laws are not equally applied to all animals across the system. And so hopefully a change in our values can perhaps strengthen our animal welfare laws, or at the very least, raise important concerns in our system. So now I draw on three Jain core values to argue for the equal protection of animals. The first is the idea of jeev, or soul, which goes to affirm the moral status of animals. The second is ahimsa, or nonviolence, which goes towards what I believe the law should owe all living beings. And then the third is anekantavad, or plurality, which encourages intellectual humility in our thinking around animals and why we should always strive to protect them. So in Jainism, a jiv is considered to have a soul and has some degree of consciousness, knowledge, and perception. These qualities contrast it with what we consider to be a jiv, or non-living matter that doesn't possess consciousness, knowledge, or perception. These values are also universal and absolute, and they apply to all living beings or jivs and give them essentially moral status. So, because animals are jivs, they have consciousness and perception, which we believe means that they have the capacity to suffer and to pursue desires similar to humans. For example, we see this has also been documented within scientific studies as well, where we see, for example, cows that grieve when their calves are separated at birth. And so this shows their capacity for emotion and suffering and pain. And so the current law fails to recognize animal jivs by considering animals or equating them to be property. And it essentially, the laws don't relate animals to the suffering they experience, but rather to human utility. And so, for example, endangered species have far more legal protection than farm animals, not necessarily because they suffer more, but rather because they are better protected by our human interests. However, the idea of jiv supports the fact that animals deserve legal protection. They're essentially beings with intrinsic moral worth and ultimately should be treated as ends in themselves and not simply mere means for humans. All animals, from 1 sensed to 5 sensed living beings, deserve legal protection under this framework. The second value here is ahimsa, or nonviolence. And this essentially states that we should first and foremost minimize harm and protect the sanctity of life. It establishes the fact that every jiv has the right to life and should be free from harm or negative interference. And it's our essential moral imperative to actually protect jiv. And so if we extend this thinking to the law, then all animals should be equally protected as well. We should make no distinction between species, for example, pets or endangered species versus farm animals, and it calls on us to minimize suffering and exploitation for all living beings. And an important caveat here as well is that legal protection does not actually require necessarily self-awareness of one's rights. For example, similarly to infants, the law already accepts that they have certain rights, even though they may not be self-aware of these rights, and yet we should grant them these rights as well. So if we apply this thinking to animals as well, who do possess intrinsic value, then they should also be granted legal protection. And finally, we have anekantavad, or the multiplicity of viewpoints that can coexist together. And in the spirit of the theme of this conference, it's very fitting that we recognize this value as well. And so some critics may make the objection that animals lack rationality, or their level of consciousness and capacity to suffer is ultimately unproven, and therefore we have no moral obligation towards them. However, even if we concede all of this, which Jainism doesn't, but for the sake of argument, if we do, then anekantavad still supports animal welfare by encouraging us to have intellectual humility in the limits of our knowledge. And essentially, what we can't prove, we shouldn't dismiss. And so while it's true that we can't fully access an animal's inner experience or precisely measure their capacity for suffering and pain, that doesn't mean that they don't have this capacity or that they don't suffer. Even if there is a meaningful possibility that animals do experience pain or fear or distress, we should exercise caution and protection in centering the needs of animals and making sure that their experiences and lives are valued as well. And so now finally, returning back to the three tenets of animal welfare, I think Jainism maps onto each of these three very directly. First, you have Jeev, which affirms the right to life for animals and supports that animals live out their natural lives. Then we have ahimsa, that demands harm reduction and supports animals to live out healthy lives where they're physically and mentally fit. And then finally, Anekantavad recenters the animal's own perspective and goes to show that they also deserve to be free from suffering. And so together, these three affirm the tenets of animal welfare. And returning back to my opening question about are some lives more valued than others, I think under our current legal system, we do see this is the case. However, this doesn't have to be. And I think by applying Jain values and a Jain framework, we can actually change the way we think about animal welfare and change the underlying values in our legal system. These are my references, and thank you so much.